I grew up poor. We didn't have cable. Internet wasn't available. We lived in a rural, isolated location, so no other kids to go out and play with. As a teen, I would often spend my time hunting or riding my bike a few miles to the river to go fishing. I was the stereotypical country boy. I was and am completely comfortable and at home in the woods by myself, even at night. We had hounds, and I took them out alone that night to go hunt raccoons. I went to our hunting grounds and turned them loose, same as I had done plenty of times before. I sat down and waited for them to open up on a track. We didn't have the best dogs. They were young and not trained up great yet. If they couldn't find a raccoon track, they would open up for a rabbit or a deer or something else. After a few minutes, they hadn't opened up, and that was very odd. I started to walk and call for them, but I wasn't getting any response. I kept walking and came out of some brush into the cow field, so I could walk easier and go call for them in the next holler over. As I come out into the cow field, I noticed the entire ridgeline, a couple 100 yards worth of ridgeline, is glowing red. I first thought that the farmer was clearing brush and had a giant bonfire burning. I went to check it out and make sure it wasn't instead a forest fire starting. As soon as I got closer to the top of the ridge, I noticed the glow was solid and not flickering the way flames should. I noticed there was no smell of smoke. I also noticed the sheer amount of light, and most of what I noticed was the color. It was red, a bright, vibrant red. The only way I can describe it is the way a stoplight on a dark street will cast a red glow on everything. That's the color that was reflecting back to me off of all the trees and in the air. It was so much light. I froze. This wasn't something natural. This was way off the beaten path with no electricity. It would be possible for a lifted 4x4 truck or tractor to get there, but no way to make that much light without a lot of vehicles lined up with their brake lights on. I had a 20 gauge single shot shotgun with me loaded with birdshot. I happened to have a few shells of buckshot and some slugs in my backpack. I quickly loaded a slug and held a few other shells in my hand for quicker follow-up shots. I prepared to defend my life. I was absolutely terrified and believed whatever was happening was a danger to me. I snuck home as quickly and as quietly as possible without using my flashlight. I told my mom and stepdad what I had just seen, but they brushed it off, and I was scolded for leaving the dogs in the woods. I guess they thought I was just lazy and didn't want to go after them or something. They knew their way home and were waiting in their doghouse for breakfast the next morning. The next day I went back and looked for any signs of what I might have seen. There was absolutely nothing out of the normal. No burnt areas from a fire, no tire tracks, nothing out of the ordinary, and I looked hard for something to explain what I had seen. A few days after that, I woke up and went into the living room. My stepdad was waiting for me. He jumped up and said he had seen the lights also. He had been hunting in another location in the opposite direction of the house, but both were still in walking distance. He was waiting for the dogs to open with his light off, when 3 bright flashes of red light lit everything around him. He said it was bright enough he could have read a newspaper. He described it like he was standing next to a fire truck that turned on its lights for a moment. We never had another encounter with the red light. I don't know what it was. I'm not saying aliens, possibly military, but I'm not ruling anything out. I joined Reddit a while back, solely looking for others that might have had a similar experience. Someone suggested a website a while back, and there was a sighting about 10 or 15 miles away with pictures of the same red color I had seen. Only this one on the link was about 10 years later, and the object they had seen changed colors a few times. The light I had experienced stayed a solid red. So the following happened around 2014 in the Appalachian Mountains of Pennsylvania. I was about 14 or 15 years old when I had this initial experience, and it left my mind until I began researching abductions and different paranormal entities. Everyone within my rural area lives in forests and hunts religiously, and I am no exception to that rule. It was about October in archery buck season in Bedford, Pennsylvania. It was a normal evening of hunting at the base of the mountain in the swamps that my family owned. My dad wasn't near me at the time, as he was waiting on the opposite end, waiting for a large buck that he had been trying to ambush. I was sitting in my climber stand in a pine tree packed area with 2 trails running underneath me. It was still fairly bright outside with just a slight darkness to the area, enough that you could see the haze of a flashlight, yet still see clearly ahead without it. I was facing the mountainside, so thick pine trees mostly covered the sky from my view. I heard leaves begin to crackle, and suddenly, roughly 5 or 6 deer ran full speed past my stand and back up the mountain. They came out of the pine saplings that lay in front of me as if they came out of nowhere. It was at that moment a massive LED-looking light flashed and seemed to fill the sky in above me. It was a bluish light and covered 3 to 4 treetops. As quickly as it flashed, it left, however, and when it left, everything turned dark. It was ridiculous to think that it turned dark that quickly, as I couldn't see the reflective side of my bow at that point. It was as if the sun just went out as soon as it went over the distant mountains on my back. I sat there dumbfounded, pondering what had happened for about 10 minutes before my dad came by in a side-by-side on the road. I left the stand that night weirded out by it, but I didn't think anything weird until the next day. I woke up with a cold sore on my left eye, which isn't unusual to me, as it happens all the time due to sunlight or stress. I got dressed and went to school, but as the day went on, I began to get a bad headache. I made it to lunch when a lunch lady, who was a personal friend, looked at me bewildered. I hadn't noticed, but the right side of my head was swollen severely. It was almost sticking out a good ½ inch, and it seemed to give me a lopsided appearance. She told me to go to the nurse's office quickly. I went to the nurse's suite, and she promptly called my mom to take me to the doctor's, as she thought I might have contracted shingles from a teacher who had an outbreak that month. We went to the doctor, and he looked at me and sent me home after explaining it was probably a poison of some kind while in the tree. I know my area, and there isn't poison oak locally, and I don't get affected by poison ivy. After I got home, I forgot about the situation and moved on. My head got better, and I didn't give it much thought until this summer, when I had my first sleep paralysis situation. After I had it, I began to look into different paranormal stuff again, and for the first time I looked into abduction stories and Mothman sightings. The conjunctivitis and different after effects made me think back to my experience in the tree stand. The reasons I'm bringing this story up is because of the lost time that went by, the sudden flash and the deer appearing from nowhere without any prior sound, and the after effects of the experience which happened the day after. I don't remember seeing anything or having nightmares directly after the incident, but it makes me wonder what I saw that night. Can you guys give me any ideas, debunks, or explanations for the events? This will be the first time I've written about this anywhere. No joke, a handful of family and friends know, but I've never put this out there before for anyone else. When I do think about it or talk about it with someone, it's difficult to talk about. The skeptics usually eat me alive. All the same, here's my story. It was a very hot summer in 2003. Humidity was insane. If you live in the southeast United States, you already understand how the heat and humidity can be, especially in August. The AC had gone out, and it would be 2 days before the part to fix the unit would arrive, so I was stuck sleeping with the windows open for 2 nights. This was my dad's cabin, and I was expected to maintain the cabin and lived rent-free as long as I stayed in college. This was just before my 22nd birthday. Fans were blowing in almost every room. Felt like dry air blowing, and it didn't help cool down the home much. I went to bed anyways, and 2 windows were open in the bedroom with a large fan blowing on me. I fell asleep even though it was so humid. I woke up at 2 a.m. sweating. The sheet was drenched in sweat, and I was simply uncomfortable. I got out of bed, changed the linens, and laid back down, still uncomfortable. The windows being left open made for very loud and obnoxious noises from the forest, loud-ass crickets and so forth. Noises I was used to, but with me trying to sleep, it was a nuisance. I shut my eyes to go back to sleep. That's when Bruno, my plot hound, starts growling. He's on the rug beside my bed, growling. I give him the typical, "Hush, Bruno," but he doesn't hush. He goes over to the window that is open. A screen separates the inside of my bedroom from the outdoors. He is staring out, growling, pure slobber dangling from his mouth. Okay, he sees a cat or bear or some animal. His growl turned into a bark growl, and he is literally upset at this point. Mind you, it's dark. Trees tower over the cabin, no moonlight, and one area light that sits at the end of the driveway. The red light from my alarm clock is the only thing I can see in my room, with nothing to see outside but the distant area light on the property that vaguely lights up just a portion of the yard and tree line. At this point, I'm worried there may be a bear, and the last thing I want is for a bear to start digging in my trash, and then I have to clean up the yard the next day. As I'm thinking this to myself and begin to get out of bed, I hear two people talking, two female voices. First thought was hikers or campers. They may be lost. No one tracks through these woods at 2 a.m., so I'm eager and curious to investigate and hopefully help. The fan is loud and I continue to hear the voices talking, and the fan caught the voices just right and made it echo. Bruno was still upset, and at this point, I'm walking to the back door to see what the hell is up. Then I got such a cold chill. It felt like the AC had suddenly kicked on, but it hadn't. I hit the back door porch light and it doesn't come on. Great. Then I open the back door to see who these two voices are. Bruno is upset and backs away from the door as I open it and hauls ass somewhere out of sight. He was very scared. I opened the back door and saw it, at the tree line maybe 7 to 8 feet tall. A black shadow in between two trees. More of a black mass, 20 feet in front of me. Two female voices came from it. The voices overlapped the other. I couldn't move, literally could not move. I immediately noticed that I started having heart palpitations and I was freezing. The shadow moved so fluidly, never really touching the ground. It was darker than black. It was obvious that these voices didn't come from it, but from everywhere and echoed. Weird languages and sounds. Then the voices stopped suddenly, and from the shadow I heard clicking. I don't know how to describe the clicking. More of a tongue clicking sound. Then silence. The shadow turned from a black mass to a fog, and I watched it raise into the trees. Then I vomited on my porch. All of this described happened in a matter of only 10 to 12 seconds, I think. I went inside and I locked the door and shut all of the windows. I found Bruno in the closet. I called my dad and asked him to come quick because I thought there may be someone on the property, and I asked him to bring his gun. He could drive to the cabin in a short 5 minutes. I was honest with him and telling him that I was freaking out. I knew he would come. I waited inside until I saw his truck lights pulling in. I unlocked the door just to let him in and I locked them back. I told my dad what I saw. He believed me and he explained to me that all of the mountains here are cursed. I told him he could take me and Bruno back to his house because I was not staying there. I got Bruno and we left with Dad. We both could smell something terrible. He thought it was an animal, but to me, it smelled like the air was thick with that evil thing. As we drove off, we saw a buck. The buck was in the middle of the road and we had to stop fully. It stood still until it collapsed right where it stood. Just collapsed. Eyes wide open still. It just dropped on the road. It then stood back up and slowly walked away. My dad said he had never seen anything like that before. That was the life-changing event that never allowed me to think about this world in the same lens ever again. It would lead to more things over the years, The feral wildmen, the witches and witchcraft, Bigfoot and so forth. I don't question their existence. I don't care if I'm not believed either. Skepticism is healthy, until it happens to you. This happened to me when I was a teenager. I think it was the spring of 1998 when I was 14. My Boy Scout troop went hiking in the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas. I grew up in a very small town in Tennessee, and the boys in my troop were people I'd known my whole life, and we were all very close and knew each other very well and trusted each other. We'd been hiking for 5 days or so, and it was miserable. It rained every day, and we were all exhausted and sore and hungry and covered with blisters. The adults realized we'd bitten off more than we could chew in trying to hike a 60-mile trail, especially with the awful weather. So we had changed course and got off the trail to spend the night in a drive-in campground. The kind of place with hookups for RVs and picnic tables and fire pits and a central bathhouse with showers and toilets. It was in a very remote area, far from a town or a house. There may have been a few other small groups there, but if there were, we never interacted with or saw any of them. We were all filthy and wet and thus very excited about taking a hot shower. It was dark and we'd finished dinner. A group of 5 of my friends, including my friend Jeremy, who, like everyone else in our group, I had known since we were babies, headed up to the bathhouse, which was maybe a quarter-mile walk through the pitch-dark woods, up a worn-down gravel walking trail. I stayed behind to clean up, and after 10 or 15 minutes followed them by myself. I had a weak little flashlight, the old incandescent kind, pre-LED. I remember the woods were totally silent. When I got about halfway to the bathhouse, I could see the light from it off in the distance through the woods. I heard a noise off to my left, and I looked over and saw my friend Jeremy, standing by an old-school manual water pump about 20 feet off the trail. You know, the kind of pump where you raise and lower a handle to pump water up from a well. There was a strange light around him, like the moon had come out from behind the clouds. I was startled to see him there by himself in the woods off the trail. I asked him if he was already done with his shower. He seemed kind of sad and he said, "Yeah, it's all yours." I said okay and didn't think much of it until I got to the bathhouse. When I walked in the door, my friends were all in there, and I heard Jeremy talking from in the shower. All the blood drained out of my head and all the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I had to sit down before I passed out. My friends were freaked out and wanted to know what was wrong. I told them about what had happened. They nervously made jokes about how I must have been smoking pot, but I could tell they believed me. Like I said, we'd known each other forever and knew when one of us was exaggerating or playing a joke. We all waited together until everyone was finished showering and brushing teeth and whatnot, and then walked back together in total silence. When we got to the spot I had seen, whoever he was gone without a trace. The water pump was there though. No one had noticed it before because it was a ways off the trail, and obviously not in use. We got back to our campsite and went to bed freaked out. I remember not sleeping much that night. In all the years since then, I've never been able to figure out what had happened. Was there a random teenage boy in the woods who looked just like my friend? Did I hallucinate it? Who's to say? It was a warm summer night in 1998. My boyfriend and I were at a state park doing what teenagers do best when they have a little freedom. It was a spot we frequented often, and many nights we'd seen weird beams of light arcing across the sky in a sweeping motion, seemingly coming from behind the hill on the other side of the pond. The beams were not unlike those you'd see at an airport, but there isn't an airport in that direction for 40 miles. And even then, it's not in the right direction and has a span of foothill mountains in between. Maybe they were spotlights someone was using, but what for, I never understood. And again, this was a state park. It's 715 acres, and utterly surrounded by farmland and privately owned forests. On this night, we were getting ready to leave, but decided to smoke a cigarette before getting into my mom's car. Looking up at the stars over the trees and the path that leads to one of the park's ponds, we spotted a large, bright, silent object coming into view. It was moving to the left, going up and down in a gentle zigzag motion. From our perspective, judging by the trees and how far above them it was, it could have been the size of a private jet. But it was silent, dead silent. The size, movement, and silence made it formidable and so very surreal. In a panic, I jumped in the driver's seat and screamed at my boyfriend to get in. He stood there for a second, saying he wanted to watch it, but when it took a turn and began to head our way, he changed his mind. I threw the car into reverse and peeled out of the parking spot. I'm speeding away, making sure to note the time as I've read too many stories of alien abduction and time loss. It was 11:13 p.m. Just then, my boyfriend turned all around in the passenger seat and yelled, "Holy shit!" No sooner had he said that than the car shifted all the way to the left, then to the right side of the road, did a complete 180 and came to a dead stop. It was still 11:13, thankfully. But the steering wheel hadn't turned. The car didn't veer to either side. It had shifted completely to both before and turning all the way around. My adrenaline pumping at this point, I asked him what had happened, and he said the light was following right behind us. It was nowhere to be seen after the car came to a stop, and after collecting myself, I managed to maneuver the car into the direction it was supposed to be and got the hell out of there. I want to say this event occurred back in 2001, as I was still in college at New Mexico State University at the time. It was fall and me and 3 other friends decided to take a camping trip up to the Gila National Forest. There was snow on the ground at our campsite, so it must have been mid to late fall. Anyways, we decided to take a day trip to go up to a remote lake that I know of that was very picturesque and serene. It took a while to get up there, but once we were there it was great until the storm came. It seemed like it came out of nowhere and it was on top of us in a ridiculous time. We didn't even make it back to my Jeep before sleet was pelting us. Once we were in the Jeep, we figured we'd better get back down to the campsite. So we headed back down the winding trail, in 4-low mind you, because by now the ground was beginning to freeze over. While we were driving through the forest trail on an ice road, tons of animals started running out across the path from left to right, and in that direction only. There were deer, elk, raccoons, rabbits, skunks, etc. That was weird in itself, but when we got to the small one-road town between the mountain and our campsite, we saw something even weirder. 6 black military-style vehicles with tarp-like coverings on the cargo areas were all driving in a convoy back up towards where we had just came from. No idea what they were doing going back up to that remote stormy location. We finally arrived back at our campsite, and we immediately noticed a huge orange glow on the horizon, just over the area of the lake we were at. It looked like a forest fire, except it didn't taper off at the ends like a fire would. And it vanished after about 2 hours. Forest fires don't do that, so what the heck? After the weird fire-looking light disappeared, we started seeing long white streaks in the sky above us that would disappear and reappear in counts of 3, 4, 2, 5, and alternate. This freaked out 2 of the guys to the point that they retired to the tent. But me and the other dude stayed up staring at these white light streaks for some time before they vanished for the night. Needless to say, we were more than eager to pack up and head back home in the morning. One last curious thing is that we stopped at a cafe on the way back to civilization to gas up and use the restroom. Outside the cafe were copies of the daily newspaper that read, "Solar flare seen in night sky." Really, I'm no expert, but I don't think our encounter that night is very indicative of solar flares. What do you guys think? Has anybody had any similar experiences? Today, I walked my usual route with my dog through some trails in my town. The trails are public but cut through private property in some areas. This property is owned by an old landlord of mine and they allow people to explore the area off-trail. That being said, I don't usually go off-trail, but today I was looking for downed pine branches after Saturday's high winds. I cut through some different scrub wood type areas and all was normal. At one point the trail forks. I took the left side and went off to the right to check around the pine trees, while more or less making a straight line to the trail that went right at the fork. I had let my dog off leash while we cut through this area. He stays within eyesight and wears a bell on his harness. About halfway through, I could no longer hear him, and the trees all of a sudden became thick enough that I couldn't see him even though I was sure he was just off to my right. When I turned and faced where I thought he was, it was as if the pine trees separated and a path appeared. It wasn't like a deer or beaver trail where brush was pushed aside. There was no undergrowth, just a seemingly straight path a few feet wide extending as far as I could see. I got this tunnel vision sensation as I looked down the path. It was as if something wanted me to follow it. I quickly looked away and hurried forward, knowing the trail should be right in front of me. Even though I made it back to the trail within a couple of minutes, it still seemed as if it took longer than it should have. I thought I could see the clearing of the trail no more than 15 yards ahead or so. When I got back on the trail, I felt very dizzy and disorientated, like I was in this brain fog that took a bit to shake. My dog came out of the woods a few moments after I did, seemingly unfazed. I felt better after 5 minutes of continuing down the trail and getting to a more open area. Maybe it was nothing, but I won't be going off trail in that spot again. This happened a few years back, and I've only told a few people. I'm afraid everyone will think I'm crazy. I'd hiked this trail many times before. The trailhead is only half-mile out of town, and you have cell signal the whole time. That's one of the bigger reasons I've felt comfortable doing it solo so many times. I spent the first mile up the mountain talking to my sister on the phone. I heard leaves crunching off the trail a few times, but with all the wildlife out there, I didn't think much of it and continued on with our talk. After we hung up, I took a quick break to catch my breath and grab a drink of water. I continued on for about 5 minutes, enjoying the quiet of the forest and the initial colors of the sun starting to set. I heard someone walking a little ways down from the trail. I assumed it was someone at a switchback further down. As I turn to look, I see an all-black figure walking upright like a human. My brain is trying to make sense of it, maybe a super skinny bear walking on its hind legs. I continue to watch as it walks behind a tree, and I'm waiting for it to appear on the other side. But nothing. It disappears, and so does the sound of its footsteps. It's absolutely silent. I've never been so terrified in my entire life, and immediately start looking around for some sort of weapon. The best I can find is a dried out stick. I knew full well it wouldn't do any good, but in my mind I needed something in my hand. That was the first time I started that trail and didn't finish, but I wanted nothing more than to be back in my car. It took me over 2 years to hike that trail again. Any thoughts on what it could be? I tried to research strange sightings in the area, but didn't find anything. I know a lot of people will claim it's an animal of some sort, but I've run into bears and other wildlife before, and this was definitely not a normal animal. A few years ago, I started hiking extensively out west. It was the first time I was exposed to elements in a way that is unlike any rural or city atmosphere. After a couple trips out there, I became comfortable with myself in the deep woods. I had woods behind my house as a kid, but nothing like this, of course. You gain a certain respect for nature after you watch the weather change rapidly. Temps drop, rise, it starts pouring all of a sudden. I also realized how much more heightened my senses were in the back country. Every sound, sight, feeling was real, all survival instinct. Nothing else from home matters when you're out there. The second time I went to Grand Teton National Park in 2018, I did a day hike that was about 20 miles. It was also the first time I was ever completely terrified by something in the woods. You start out at the parking lot of Jenny Lake and hike over Paintbrush Divide and down to Solitude Lake, then back down through Cascade Canyon. We hit about mile 15 and took a break. 5 miles to go, no problem. It's all flat and downhill from here. By that point, I had exhausted myself. We were about an hour and a half from darkness. When your body has been through stressful physical activity, your brain kind of goes numb and you just put one foot in front of the other. Your instincts take a backseat to your physical needs. Survive, get out before dark. Walking down through Cascade Canyon in my numb state, I instantly felt the skin on the back of my neck start crawling. Fearful and without even thinking, I whipped my head around, stopped, and scanned everything. The forest just kind of starts breathing back at you at that point. All the leaves and trees just visually pulse back at you and you stand still. Silence. Okay, it was nothing. Keep walking. The forest is alive. I can see it. Light fades a bit more. We're again walking, but now I have this constant stress in the back of my neck like I'm being followed. My skin crawls again, and I turn around and stand and stare yet once more. My mind is racing. Something moves in the trees. I focus in on it. What is that? The forest is breathing back at me again. Silence. 3 miles to go. Light is fading quicker. We push the final descent down through very thick underbrush. Any moment thinking something is going to reach out and grab me. I feel like every time I turn around to check behind me, whatever it is just sneaking back into the woods out of sight. Finally down to Jenny Lake, 1.5 miles to go. My mind is numb again. I hear a grunt about 10 feet from me. Come on, dude, don't do that. Do what? Stop trying to scare me. I didn't say anything. I stop. I turn around again. Stop, scan, stare. Nothing. Forest is breathing back at me. The car is a beacon of hope as I finally return to safety. Well, you ask, what's so scary about all of this? Me and the space between my ears. Physical and mental fatigue had turned me into an anxiety-ridden mess who was being stalked by something. Was something in those woods? Maybe. Maybe my survival instinct was secretly keeping me on my toes. I've never before felt so connected to the place I was in, and all 5 of my senses were working at 200% to keep me alert. Nature is terrifying, and I love it.